We are live.
All right, so I'm going to start today. My name is Samantha Foltz, and I just wanted to kind of introduce our topic really quick before we dive into the literature review. We did our project on a study called Internet-Based Contingency Management Increases Walking in Sedentary Adults by Curti and Valerie from 2013. So this study kind of looked at a few different things that we're going to talk about, but just to give you a background, it was basically, looking at exercise and how to increase that in sedentary adults, kind of like the title says. So I'm just gonna dive in here, and we'll see how this goes. So physical activity guidelines from the CDC with the Center for Disease Control talk about setting a guideline for adults to exercise at a moderate intensity for about 150 minutes or about 2.5 hours per week. Moderate intensity exercise can be any activity that uses about as much energy that you would experience, that uses about as much energy that you would for like a brisk walk. So more than just, walking around the house. Meeting that 150-minute guideline can help decrease risk for a lot of different medical conditions, including hypertension, other types of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and even some types of cancer. So kind of getting on board and getting those 150 minutes of exercise is really important. However, only less than 5% of adults actually get that much exercise every week. So those who do meet the recommendations, we kind of want to look at them and see what they're doing so that we can figure out how to get the rest of the population up that high. Most of them are doing it without expensive equipment, without investing a lot of money, or even really going to gyms. One way to complete that goal is to walk about 1,000 steps a day for most days out of the week. So that's another goal that not necessarily set forth by the CDC, but it's something that would be equivalent. So a lot of research studies have used that as a baseline for what to, or not necessarily baseline, but for what to strive for in order to equate that 150 minutes a day, 150 minutes a week. In order to get that 10,000 steps a day, most adults would have to participate in about 30 minutes of moderate intensity exercise every day. So that's kind of, those things kind of line up pretty evenly. However, again, most adults only take about 5,000 steps, or half the amount each day. So research on programs to increase exercise has demonstrated that programs should be simple, convenient, and inexpensive. One way to help accomplish those goals in a program is to make it internet-based, because the internet is so accessible and a lot of people are learning how to use it and use it for different things. However, the research on using internet-based programs to increase exercise in adults is mixed. Some have shown promising results in decreasing waist circumference, cholesterol, and even risk for heart disease, but again, those results are mixed. So we want to try and find out what exactly we can do and how we can make these better so that more of them are leaning towards some more promising results. Some limitations of research on exercise, especially web-based programs, is including the fact that a lot of exercise is self-report. It's difficult to determine whether or not the person actually did the exercise, and especially if we're considering step count, that's not just a set period of time, that's all day. So trying to figure out how to monitor that is a little bit difficult as well. One way that we've seen a lot of studies do is to use different types of pedometers. The study that we replicated used a Fitbit. We did not use a Fitbit because of other concerns, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. The study that we replicated used a website to kind of be the medium that the participants would engage with every day, that was their internet-based program. So they would log on, they would upload a video and saying what their step count was, and kind of do a little log of what kind of activities they did that day in order to achieve that step count. They also used goal setting to help the participants gradually increase their steps, and we'll talk about more of that in our method section. the one thing that the study that we replicated did do that we weren't able to do was they did use contingency management to compare the effects of adding some type of reinforcement for reaching goals to not having any of that reinforcement for reaching goals. We weren't able to do that within the confines of this experiment for the class project, but we were able to replicate the goal setting condition where, you know, if they walked this many steps this time, then the next goal was set at this level, and seeing that if just goal setting alone and logging on to a web-based program would actually help increase step count. So that's kind of what we were looking at with our study, and that's what the goals were for the one half of the study that we looked at. So with that, I will take it to Sarah for the methods section.
Hi, I'm Sarah. We're going to talk about our methods section. First of all, the materials needed that we needed for this replication was the physical activity readiness questionnaire, a health status questionnaire, the actual smartwatch, the VeryFit 2.0 app, a computer, a smart cell phone, internet access, pencil, pen, paper, Excel, a video camera, an activity log, and Ball State University access to the Blackboard website. The setting was in the location of all of the participants choosing. Our behavior definition was while standing, stepping looks like picking up alternating feet 3 inches off the ground and then placing them back on the ground. Examples of this would include walking, skipping, running, and jogging. Stepping is not tapping your shoes, jumping up and down, or moving your feet while sitting. A little bit more about our participants. The six members of this research project are part of a graduate level course in applied behavior analysis. They have been randomly assigned to a group as a part of a semester-long project. All members of this study are graduate level students and are female. The 6 participants ranged in ages from 23 to 32. 5 of the participants were white, while 1 was African American. According to the questionnaire, 5 of the 6 participants said that they work out 2 or less times a week. Only 1 participant said that she exercised 6 times per week. All participants had access to a computer. None of the females in this study suffer from any mental or medical conditions, such as asthma, hypertension, depression, etc. Prior to the baseline data being collected, each participant completed all screening measures and submitted them to a secured database. These screening measures included questions about their age, health, and exercise, whether or not they had any medical conditions, about their physical activity, and whether or not they had access to internet at their place of residence. Screening measures also included other questionnaires. Specifically, they completed a history questionnaire about their demographics, general health, medication use. The PARQ was a screening measure that identified for who had low to moderate intensity exercises, and the HSQ, which was a measure that identified participants low, medium, and high risk for cardiovascular disease. For treatment fidelity, to ensure that that the assessment data was taken accurately, the treatment protocol was followed. All participants purchased the smartwatch and downloaded the VeryFit 2.0 app, and we all read the directions to use the device. All group members were aware of what the device was to track the participants' steps throughout the day. Also, each participant familiarized themselves with the research that was to be duplicated. The participants also participated in a discussion that was developed research replication. Each participant familiarized themselves with the operational definition of the target behavior. To ensure accuracy of the treatment intervention, participants were reinforced by a daily video upload to the group Blackboard discussion board under a thread that was designed for them to ensure proper protocol. Overall, problems generally did not arise with the device's fidelity. Minor problems that occurred including the battery running out during the day, and the participant was not aware, or forgetting to put the device on, or leaving the device somewhere where the participant was not at. The participants made comments in reference to the usage or lack thereof when they were recording their steps. For inter-observer agreement, our IOA data was collected by having an independent researcher watch 40% of the videos posted for each phase and record the number of steps viewable on the pedometer. Due to the inability to record data differently, IOA was calculated by the total count IOA. Specifically, the smaller step count was divided by the larger step count, and the quotient was then multiplied by 100 to express IOA as a percentage. IOA was 100% for all participants across all phases of the study. So I'm done, and I'm going to hand it over to Andrea.
Hello, my name is Andrea Heath, and I will be discussing the procedures for the Kurdi and Daleri replication study. The first thing that the group members did was purchase the Vahuala TW64 smartwatch through Amazon. Upon receiving the watches, group members downloaded the VeriFit 2.0 app. This app was required to not only make the smartwatch functional, but also to input personal information such as height for accurate and personalized step counts. Each group member completed the daily data collection procedure, which occurred throughout baseline and the intervention phases. The procedure consisted of wearing the smartwatch at all times except for swimming, bathing, and sleeping, unless we so chose to wear it. And then before midnight, we would post our data in two places. First, group members posted to the Blackboard group discussion board. In each post, we would upload a video. As part of the video, we would visually present the step count on the watch, verbally state the date, and then verbally state the step count. In addition to the video, we included a typed activity log for each post, which included the typed step count and the topography of activities for the day. The second place that group members shared their data was through an online Excel file through Microsoft OneDoc. Each member would find their individual page and then enter the step count into the corresponding date, which then populated their data into a line graph, which helped to keep track of progress. The phases were 5-day phase blocks, which consisted throughout baseline and the intervention. Baseline started on October 15th, and then the first phase goal was calculated by averaging the 5 days of baseline plus 1,000 steps. The intervention started on October 20th and was 5 phases of 5 days each. There were no consequences for meeting or not meeting our goals. The criteria for a new goal was to meet the phase goal for 3 of the 5 days. If we did not meet this criteria, the goal was repeated. If the criteria was met, a new phase goal was formulated in 2 ways. The first way was if the goal was met for the 3 of the 5 days and the phase average did not exceed 1,000 steps of the previous goal, then the new phase goal was the previous plus 1,000. The second method was if the goal was met for 3 of the 5 days and the average did exceed 1,000 steps of the previous goal, then the new goal was the 4th highest step count for that phase. Data collection terminated on November 14th, and now Zakira, will discuss the results.
Hi, I'm Zakira, and I'm going to discuss the results. Our data shows that only 1 of the 6 participants had improvements in the steps per day according to the experimenter arranged criteria. As in Kurdi and Daleri, each participant's steps were calculated on a percentage improvement during the final 2 blocks, 2 blocks of the intervention days, during which the goal for each participants were 10,000 steps per day. Relative to pre-intervention walking levels, participants' average steps per day during the screening periods. Participant Samantha had a 12.8 block 4 and 5 of the intervention stage compared to the pre-intervention stage. The other 5 participants had little to no increase in data, and the data decreased from pre-intervention with percentages ranging from 5.2% to a 7% decrease. The median was 35.1%. 3 of the 6 participants raised their goal of 1,000 steps during intervention at least once, and 2 of the 6 participants repeated the same goal throughout the intervention. The ratings might be attributable to the technical difficulties these participants experienced during the experience, such as leaving the watch at home, being sick, the battery dying, and the data erasing once it was synced to the VeryFit 2.0 app. First, we'll have Samantha show her graph of her data.
So I'm going to quickly go over my graph. I'm going to try and hold it up so that you can see, but I know it's a little hard on the video. So as you can see, my baseline was increasing. It was not quite steady. So that's one thing that we generally look for in studies, but in this in the setup for this experiment, we just stopped it at 5 days because that's how the original study did it. So we went ahead and moved on to treatment despite not having a stable baseline and it being increasing. So my step count for the first time was calculated based off the average of my baseline data points. I did not meet criteria for increasing my goal for moving to the second treatment phase, so it stayed the same. And as you can see, it's still kind of variable. The second time we moved, I did get to move up a little bit, but it was still not very much. There's still a lot of variability. I had one down here, one up here. It's kind of staggered, so the variability isn't really indicative of what we would like to see for a true changing criterion design. We also had some instances, I know I'm not the only one, where we had missing data. So like on this day, I know I think my watch had died halfway through the day and I hadn't noticed, and by the time I got home to log it, I couldn't really do any more steps for the day because it was time to log it already. So I ended up with a 0 step count for that day because that is what the original experimenters did. And I think, personally, I think that's kind of why this one went up, but I do think that's why my average for this one was a little bit lower. Just to keep in mind that I did have a little bit of a changing criterion, but not, there was still a lot of variability even for the one person who did have more of a changing criterion design. So that's something we want to keep in mind when interpreting the results. And now I will pass it off to, I think Zachara is next. I'm sorry if I said your name wrong.
Okay, here's my graph for, sorry, my lighting is terrible. My graph, I think I had one day where I did 20,000, and that set the bar really high. And then during intervention, I had one day where I stayed home sick, not wear the watch at all that day. But the first 2 blocks, the criteria stayed the same. My goals were the same that day. The third block, I had a increase of 1,000 steps. And then the last block, the 4th and 5th block, I'm sorry, had the same goal. Next, we'll have Emily with her graph.
Here is my graph. My baseline increased and then decreased over the next few days. The step count was calculated by the average plus 1,000. My first treatment was successful and I was able to increase my goal. The second, third, fourth, and fifth treatment phases were remained the same. I did not meet my goal. I also had issues with my watch syncing to my phone and the app on the phone, and I ended up losing data on 2 different occasions. So that also played a role in the data. I will pass it over to Andrea. All right, so here is my graph. Hard to tell if I have it all in the camera. Okay, so my first phase goal was 12,646, and as you can see, that maintained to be my phase goal throughout the entire project. I did at least meet the goal at least one time per each phase. One of them I met the goal 2 times. In terms of baseline, I feel like my average was highly skewed by this day right here, where I went shopping and spent hours upon hours walking, which is completely abnormal for my life. In terms of phase 4, I have this data point here. This is inaccurate because my child hid my smartwatch and it took me about 8 hours to find it. Other low points were typically on the weekends, and that is when I do all my homework and all my studying, so I have very low step counts anytime it's the weekend. Next up will be Elizabeth to discuss her graph.
Thanks, Andrea. I'm Elizabeth, and before I show you my graph, I'm actually just going to talk about it a little bit first. So my daily step frequency remained fairly stable throughout, with a couple of exceptions in phase 1 and phase 3 of the treatment. As you'll see, my baseline was much higher than my treatment, so which I think was mostly due to the fact that during baseline was taken over a weekend that I happened to go hiking a lot. So for me, baseline was probably not an accurate representation of my average daily step frequency, and it made it a little bit more difficult for me to actually reach my goals during the treatment phases, which stayed the same throughout the entire experiment. So here we are. Okay, I'm going to pass it back. I'm going to pass it on to Sarah next.
My printer quality is really bad, so I mean, I'll show that I have my graph, but I'm actually going to share it with you guys really quick. That way you can see. Okay, so I had the same problem that majority of you had. I was actually on vacation during baseline in a city that was majority walking, so I had really high step count during baseline, and then for the rest of the time I had the same goal for all treatment phases. And I also struggled with the fact that I would wear my device for a couple of days in a row, and then usually on like the second day or the third day I was wearing it, it would die, and I would lost a bunch of steps those days. But if this study was done by days, like days that you met your goal, I would have met it a lot more versus the average of 5 days. Since it was the average of 5 days though, I did not meet my goal at all. So I'll turn it back over to Elizabeth.
All right, now onto the discussion of our presentation. So in the following discussion, we will identify some weaknesses in both the original and the replicated studies, and also offer some suggestions for future replication. We covered more detail, of course, in our report. So for purposes of brevity for this presentation, I'm just going to go over a couple of issues that we found particularly important and interesting. So the purpose of the study, again, was to measure changes in stepping or walking behavior among 6 graduate student women when self-monitoring treatment conditions were implemented. And the dependent and independent measures were intended to replicate Curdy and Dallery 2013. So we did encounter a few complications in the replication process. First, we were unable to replicate the original study's exclusionary criterion for determining which participants actually completed the full study. And I'll talk about why that's relevant in just a minute. After the baseline phase, the original study excluded all participants who took an average greater than 6,000 steps on average per day. If we had done that with our replicated study, we would have only had 2 participants, since 4 out of the 6 participants walked an average of greater than 9,000 steps during baseline. The exclusionary criterion is important, however, because the experimental design utilized by the original study was a changing criterion design. And so this means that with each new phase, a new treatment goal was set based on the data from the treatment phase prior. So each participant should have seen an increase in frequency step goals at the end of each phase, as we talked about, an increase in 1,000 steps, for example. However, in the replicated study, most of the participant step goals remain the same for the duration of the study, as we mentioned. And since the experimental design was not followed precisely, it's not really possible to determine if any change or lack of change in frequency of steps across phases is attributable to the treatment condition. So in other words, we aren't able to determine if wearing the pedometer and journaling our step topography influenced our stepping behavior. So one recommendation for future studies would be to alter the exclusionary criteria, as well as the formula for determining new step frequency goals, so that it suits future participant demographics. This is a great example of how behavior change goals should be relevant and socially significant to the participants in order to produce an outcome. Second, treatment fidelity was an issue with respect to recording our step count each day. Participants were not required to record their step frequency at a consistent time each day. Therefore, the interval between samples varied greatly from day to day. So for example, participant 1 took her video of her step count at 10 p.m. one day, and at 9 p.m. the next day, and then at 11:30 of the next day. This variability demonstrates some weaknesses in the experimental design because it prevents the participant from recording frequency accurately as the number of steps per unit of time. And so a fairly easy way to remedy that would be to require the participants to record their step frequency at the same time each day. Participants could rely on an alarm on their pedometer. The original study used a Fitbit, which of course has many more capabilities than the item that we actually used. So we could rely on an alarm of some sort to prompt accurate recording of data. And so now I'm going to send it back over to Emily for some closing remarks.
Okay, I'm Emily. The lack of reinforcement could have certainly played a role in all of the participants' overall step percentages. In the original study, participants were reinforced with the contingency reinforcement when their goal was met. Unfortunately, that is not the case in this study due to our circumstances. A personal reinforcement may have acted as a better motivator to all of the participants instead of just goal setting and posting the video to an online discussion forum. Also, another reinforcer that could have caused a motivational issue is the technology issues that were mentioned during the data portion. Participants noted difficulties with the VeriFit application and including watch maybe falling off, losing the battery, forgetting to put it on, and then also losing data when the watch syncs with the phone application. Finally, participants noted forgetting to put on the watch in the morning or forgetting the watch over the weekend, and these all could have made a negative impact on the data collection and motivational processes. In order to motivate a positive behavior change with participants, it is important to include a reinforcement that is motivating to all participants. And this concludes our replication study.